For 16 years, the people of Red Willow Crossing knew Elias Crowe as the quiet old man who sat on his porch every morning drinking coffee and minding his own business. They never asked about the scars on his hands or why conversations stopped when he walked past. Then a ruthless land company sent 9 armed men to force him off his property by sundown, and the town was about to discover why no one had ever spoken his name out loud. In 90 seconds of gunfire, a forgotten legend rose from that weathered porch chair, and 3 young men learned the hardest lesson of their lives. The most dangerous man in any room is the one who stopped fighting years ago and hoped he'd never have to start again. Before we dive in, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? The porch boards gave a low groan under the weight of 3 men who had no right to stand there. Dusk had settled over the street, turning everything the color of old rust, and the air hung still the way it does before a storm that hasn't decided whether to break or just threaten all night. The old man sat in his chair like he'd grown from it, his hands resting on the armrests, his boots planted flat. He didn't look up when the riders came, didn't acknowledge the creak of leather or the metallic ring of spurs or the way their shadows fell across him like a claim being staked. The one in front, taller than the others with a face that looked like it had been carved from something harder than wood, stepped close enough that his boot nearly touched the old man's chair. He didn't shout. Men who are used to being obeyed don't need to raise their voices. He just said it plain, the way you might tell someone the time of day. You need to be gone from here. The old man didn't answer. He shifted his weight slightly, adjusted the heel of one boot against the worn planks. The motion was small enough that you might miss it if you weren't watching, but it said everything about a man who had stopped running from things a long time ago. Across the street, faces appeared in windows and then disappeared just as quick. Everyone in Red Willow Crossing knew what sundown meant when men like these came calling. It meant decisions got made, and blood was the ink that signed them. The riders' companions stood a few paces back, their hands never quite settling. One of them, younger with a scar that hooked down from his left eye, laughed without much humor in it. The sound carried in the quiet. Old man probably can't hear you, Garrett. Probably forgot where he is. The one called Garrett didn't smile. He just kept his eyes on the figure in the chair, studying him the way you might study a fence post you need to move but aren't quite sure how deep it's set. He put his boot against the chair leg and pushed, not hard, just enough to make it scrape backward an inch. This porch doesn't belong to you anymore. The land under it doesn't belong to you. Come morning, there'll be equipment here, and you won't want to be in the way of it. Some ground is paid for in years, not deeds. The porch had seen 23 summers since the old man built it, back when his hands were steadier and the town still believed it might amount to something. Every nail he'd driven himself. Every board he'd measured and cut and fitted. It wasn't much to look at now, weathered gray and split in places, but it held. That was more than could be said for most things. The third rider, heavy-set with tobacco stains in his beard, stepped forward and reached for the old man's hat. That's when something in the air changed, subtle as a held breath. The old man's eyes lifted for the first time, and they were clear as river stone. The rider's hand stopped halfway, though he probably couldn't have said why. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Garrett stepped back, and the others followed. "Sundown tomorrow," Garrett said. "Don't be here." They left the way they came, boots heavy on the steps, and the street seemed to exhale when they mounted up and rode toward the edge of town where the new construction waited like a promise or a threat, depending on where you stood. The old man sat in his chair and watched them go. When they were out of sight, he reached down and picked up the coffee cup that had gone cold beside him. His hands didn't shake. Red Willow Crossing had been something once, back in 1873 when silver still mattered and the railroad hadn't yet decided to run its tracks 20 miles south. Now it was 1889, and the town had settled into the kind of tired existence that marks places built on hope that didn't quite deliver. The buildings sagged a little more each year. Paint peeled like sunburned skin. But people stayed because leaving took a kind of energy most folks had used up just arriving. Elias Crowe had lived in Red Willow for 16 years, though if you asked anyone in town, they'd be hard-pressed to tell you much about him beyond what they saw. He minded his business. He took his coffee at dawn, always sitting in the same chair, always facing the street. He didn't socialize much, didn't attend church or town meetings. But he was there, constant as the cottonwoods that lined the creek, and that counted for something in a place where people tended to drift through like dust. There were things people noticed if they paid attention. The way he moved, economical and deliberate, like a man who had learned not to waste motion. The scars on his hands, old and white against the tan skin. The way conversations would sometimes pause when he walked past, not from fear exactly, but from something adjacent to it. Respect, maybe, or the memory of respect, passed down from people who knew things they didn't talk about anymore. Men who've seen enough don't rush. That was how Elias carried himself, and it had become part of the town's rhythm. Mornings you'd see him on that porch, steam rising from his cup, watching the street come to life. The baker across the way would nod. The woman who ran the boarding house would sweep her steps and exchange the briefest greeting. Children on their way to the schoolhouse would go quiet until they passed, then resume their noise. It was a small life, narrowed by choice, and for 16 years it had been enough. But now there was the matter of the land. Cole Hardin's land company had been buying up parcels all through the county, offering prices that seemed fair until you realized there wasn't anywhere else to go with the money. The railroad was coming after all, just delayed, and where the railroad went, towns either grew or died. Hardin was betting on growth, and he bought everything from the creek to the ridge except for 3 properties whose owners had declined to sell. 2 of those owners had changed their minds in the past month after visits from men who knew how to be persuasive without breaking any laws that could be proven. The 3rd owner was sitting on a porch drinking cold coffee and showing no signs of moving. The question hanging over Red Willow Crossing wasn't whether Elias would leave. It was whether the town would survive what happened if he didn't. Cole Hardin's reputation had arrived in Red Willow 2 weeks before the man himself. Stories carried on freight wagons, and in the conversation of traveling salesmen, painted a picture of someone who built empires one reluctant signature at a time. He didn't burn people out or hire obvious gunmen to make threats. He employed lawyers and leveraged debt and found legal mechanisms that left people homeless with all the proper paperwork filed. The graves he left were economic, not literal, but they were graves all the same. The riders who had visited Elias's porch were Hardin's advance men. Garrett Webb had worked for the company for 7 years and had overseen evictions in 4 territories. The younger one with the scar was named Pike, and he had a reputation for enjoying his work a little too much. The heavy one was Donner, who didn't talk much but could lift a grown man by his collar and walk him out of a building without breaking stride. Together, they represented the kind of civilized violence that courts didn't prosecute and newspapers didn't print. They'd given Elias until sundown the next day to clear out. After that, the deed would be enforced. Hardin himself was riding in from Cheyenne with 6 more men and a territory judge who owed him favors. The law would be on their side, written down and stamped official. The porch would be torn down. The house behind it would be demolished. The land would be cleared and graded and turned into something profitable. But there was a complication nobody had accounted for, a detail that had been buried in the kind of history that lives in old men's memories rather than newspaper archives. 10 years earlier, in the border wars that had turned Kansas and Missouri into killing grounds, there had been a man who rode with neither the Union sympathizers nor the Confederate holdouts, but took contracts from both when the price was right. He'd been known for 2 things. He never took a second contract on the same man, and he never missed. People said he'd killed 17 men in fair fights and twice that many from ambush. They said he could track a man across rock. They said his real name was lost somewhere in the smoke of burning homesteads and that he'd died in a gulch outside Abilene in 1879. Most of what people said was wrong. His name was Elias Crowe, and he'd been sitting on a porch in Red Willow Crossing for 16 years, waiting to see if the past would stay buried or come looking. The morning after the riders' visit, while the town was still deciding whether to watch or hide, an old man arrived on the early stage. He was thin as a rail, with white hair that hung past his shoulders and hands that trembled with palsy. He walked straight to Elias's porch without asking directions and sat down on the step without invitation. "Heard you had company," the old man said. His voice shook less than his hands did. Elias poured a second cup of coffee from the pot he kept warm on a small stove just inside the door. Word travels. Always did where you were concerned. The visitor's name was Samuel Cross, and he'd ridden with Elias during the bad years. He'd been the one who could read maps and judge distances and knew which towns had honest sheriffs and which had sheriffs who could be bought. He'd been the planner, the thinker. Elias had been the instrument. They sat in silence for a while, watching the street. A freight wagon passed, heading south. Someone was hammering in one of the shops, repairing something that would need repairing again before long. "You planning to leave?" Samuel asked. "No, didn't think so." Samuel reached into his coat and pulled out a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. He set it on the porch boards between them. "Figured you might need these." Elias didn't unwrap it, but he knew what was inside. The Colt revolver he'd carried during the war, cleaned and oiled and preserved the way you preserve things you hope never to use again, but can't quite throw away. Ammunition, 50 rounds, still dry. A knife with a handle worn smooth from use. A name doesn't age if the hand remembers. Elias had spent 16 years proving that theory, letting his skills rust in the hope that rust was the same as gone. He'd known it wasn't true. You don't forget how to read ground or calculate range or know when a man is about to draw. You just stop practicing, and eventually people forget you ever knew. "How many are coming?" Elias asked. Maybe 10. Hardin brings 6 of his own. The 3 you met yesterday. Maybe a couple locals he hires for show. When? Tomorrow at sundown. He likes to make a spectacle of it. Brings that judge to read the deed out loud. Makes it look legal. Elias nodded slowly. The numbers weren't good, but numbers rarely were. He looked at his porch, at the boards he'd cut and the nails he'd driven and the space he'd claimed not through violence, but through the simple act of staying. Some fights you chose. Others chose you. Either way, you were in them. That night, after the town had gone to sleep or was pretending to, Elias lifted 3 floorboards in the back corner of the porch where water damage had given him an excuse to replace them years ago. Underneath was a shallow space lined with tin to keep out moisture. Inside that space was the rifle he'd used for long-distance work, a Sharps that could drop a man at 500 yards if the wind was right and your hands were steady. He'd fired it exactly once since moving to Red Willow, testing it to make sure it still worked, then wrapped it and buried it again. The barrel was clean. The action was smooth. The sight was still calibrated. He spent 2 hours measuring sight lines from the porch, marking angles in his mind. The general store across the street had a second-floor window that looked down on the approach from the north. The boarding house had a balcony with cover behind a false front. The saloon's roof was flat and accessible from the back stairs. He knew all this because he'd studied it 16 years ago when he first arrived, the way you study things when you're a man people might come looking for. Samuel stayed with him, not saying much, just being present the way soldiers are present. They moved through the preparation with the efficiency of practice, and by midnight, everything that could be made ready was ready. The rest was up to how the next day unfolded. "You don't have to do this," Samuel said, though they both knew it was a lie. "Some things you have to do because of who you were, and there's no outrunning that." "The town shouldn't suffer for my choice," Elias said. "Town's already suffering. Hardin will take it all eventually whether you fight or run. Maybe. But they'll remember someone stood." Samuel left before dawn, heading south on a horse he'd borrowed. He was too old to be useful in a gunfight, and pride wasn't worth dying for when you were already on borrowed time. Elias watched him go, then sat in his chair as the sun came up. The coffee tasted better than usual, or maybe he was just paying more attention. Across the street, the baker opened his shop and the boarding house woman swept her steps and children headed toward school. The day proceeded like any other day, ordinary and precious because of it. Around noon, a young man named Tom Ferris climbed the steps to the porch. He was barely 20, the son of the blacksmith, and he had the kind of idealism that age hasn't worn down yet. He carried an old Spencer rifle and enough fear that his hand shook. "Mr. Crowe, I'd like to help if you'll have me." Elias studied him for a long moment. "You know what you're asking?" "Yes, sir." "You know you might die?" "Yes, sir." "What?" The young man struggled with the words, trying to find something that made sense. Finally, he just said, "Because you shouldn't have to stand alone." Elias directed him to the store window across the street and told him to stay low, shoot careful, and leave if things went bad. The boy nodded and went, and Elias felt the weight of one more life on a ledger that was already heavy. An hour later, the shopkeeper's brother, a man named Dutch who'd fought in the real war and still walked with a limp from it, took position on the saloon roof. He didn't ask permission, just nodded to Elias and climbed the stairs. 3 against 10. The numbers were still bad, but they were better. Deadlines are just another kind of gun. The sun moved across the sky with the indifference of something that has watched this scene play out 1,000 times in 1,000 towns. People stayed inside. The street emptied. By late afternoon, Red Willow Crossing looked like a place abandoned, except for the old man sitting on his porch and the 2 allies positioned where they could see and shoot and maybe, if luck held, survive. They came at sundown, exactly as promised. 9 riders moving at a walk, spreading out as they entered the main street. Garrett Webb rode in front, flanked by Pike and Donner. Behind them came Cole Hardin himself, a man in his 50s with silver hair and a suit that cost more than most people earned in a year. He sat his horse like someone who had learned to ride for business rather than pleasure, competent but not natural. The territory judge rode beside him, looking uncomfortable and wishing he was anywhere else. The other 4 were hired guns, obvious in the way they scanned rooflines and kept their hands free. Hardin reined up 30 feet from the porch. He had papers in his hand, legal documents with seals and signatures. He looked at Elias, sitting in his chair, and something flickered across his face. Recognition, maybe, or the first whisper of doubt. "Mr. Crowe, I have here a deed of foreclosure properly executed and witnessed. You have until I finish reading this document to vacate the premises. If you refuse, you will be removed by force and charged with trespassing." Elias didn't move. His hands rested on the arms of his chair. The Colt was under a folded blanket on his lap, invisible but ready. "I paid for this land," Elias said quietly. "Not in money. In years. In peace kept. That deed doesn't mean anything here." Hardin's jaw tightened. "The law says otherwise. The law changes depending on who's holding the pen. I'm not leaving." That's when Garrett Webb made his mistake. He drew his pistol, not to fire but to emphasize the point, to make it clear how this was going to end. The motion was smooth and practiced, but it was also the signal that negotiations were over. From a store window across the street, young Tom Ferris fired his Spencer, and the sound cracked through the evening like the first stone of an avalanche. The shot went wide, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that the opening had been made. Elias came up from his chair with the Colt already clearing the blanket, and his first round took Garrett Webb in the chest before the man could bring his pistol to bear. The power dynamic that had held the town frozen for weeks shattered in that instant. The riders scattered, horses screaming and rearing, men diving for cover behind water troughs and hitching posts. Dutch fired from the roof, his rifle barking twice in quick succession. One of the hired guns went down. Another took a round in the shoulder and wheeled his horse around, heading back the way he'd come. Pike returned fire toward the store window, his bullets punching through the glass and sending Tom Ferris scrambling backward. From the porch, Elias worked with the efficiency of practice, each shot deliberate, each motion minimal. He hit Donner in the leg as the big man tried to flank toward the alley. He put a round through the barrel beside Hardin's head, close enough that the land broker felt the wood splinter against his cheek. The fight lasted maybe 90 seconds, though time does strange things when metal is flying and men are dying. When the noise stopped, 4 riders were down. 2 more were wounded and trying to stay mounted. Hardin had dismounted and taken cover behind the water trough with the judge pressed flat against the dirt beside him. And Pike was still shooting, but wild now, panicked. From a store, Tom Ferris made his next mistake. He stood to get a better angle, silhouetting himself against the light from the back room. Pike's shot caught him in the side, spinning him around. He went down hard, and Dutch roared something wordless from the roof and fired 3 times fast. Pike's horse collapsed. The young gunman rolled clear, but Dutch's 4th shot found him. He didn't get up. Elias felt the bullet before he heard it, a white-hot line across his ribs that told him someone had gotten a piece of him. He turned and put 2 rounds into the alley where the shot had come from, then moved back behind the porch post. His left side was wet. Not arterial, but steady. He needed to deal with it soon, or it would deal with him. "Hardin," he called out. His voice carried in the sudden quiet. "Take your men and go. This land isn't worth dying for." There was a long pause. Then Hardin's voice, tight with rage and fear, came from behind the trough. "You've killed my men. The law just got shot to pieces. You want to keep testing me?" Skill speaks once. Silence answers after. The remaining riders looked at their wounded, at the bodies in the street, at the old man standing on the porch with blood spreading across his shirt and a revolver that hadn't wavered. Whatever they'd been paid, it wasn't enough for this. One by one, they mounted up or helped the wounded into saddles. Hardin stayed behind the trough until the very last. And when he finally stood, his face was white with fury. But he went. He mounted his horse and rode out with the judge scrambling after him. And the street fell silent except for the sound of a young man groaning in the store across the way. The smoke cleared slowly, drifting in the still evening air like something reluctant to leave. Dutch climbed down from the roof and ran to check on Tom Ferris. Elias sat down heavily in his chair, one hand pressed against his side. The bleeding was already slowing, the wound shallow like he'd thought. He'd had worse. He'd survived worse. The town emerged in ones and twos, people stepping into the street to see what remained. The doctor came at a run, heading for the store where Dutch was trying to keep pressure on Tom's wound. Someone brought blankets to cover the dead. The baker stood on his porch staring at the porch across the way, at the old man who'd been sitting there every morning for 16 years, and maybe seeing him clearly for the first time. By morning, the story would already be changing. Numbers would shift. Details would become uncertain. That's how legends work, built on truth, but polished by repetition until the shine matters more than the substance. But for now, in the quiet after violence, there was just a town trying to understand what had happened and what would come next. Tom Ferris would live, though he'd carry a scar and a story. Dutch would go back to his quiet life, content to have stood when it mattered. And Elias Crowe would sit on his porch, his coffee going cold beside him, and watch the sun come up on land that was his because he'd refused to let it be anything else. The wound healed slowly, the way wounds do when you're past the age where bodies bounce back easy. People brought him food without asking, left it on the porch steps, and walked away. Children stopped being afraid of him, or maybe started being afraid in a different way, the kind of fear that's mixed with respect. The porch chair got a new coat of oil to protect the wood where bullets had splintered it. Some men guard a place long after the war leaves it. Cole Hardin never came back to Red Willow Crossing, though his lawyers did, making noise about charges and damages until they realized no judge in the territory would touch it. You can't prosecute a legend, and that's what Elias had become, whether he wanted it or not. The land stayed his. The porch stayed standing. And every morning when the sun came up, you could find him there, watching the street come to life, a reminder that some things hold when everything else wants to move.